Street. Bush 41 spent the summer at his home in Kennebunkport, Maine. Condolences and fond memories are pouring in from presidents, former advisors, and well-wishers from around the world. He's being remembered as a statesman, an icon of the greatest generation, and one of a kind. Brett Baer looks back at the life of this American hero.
For a new breeze is blowing, and a world refreshed by freedom seems reborn. For in man's heart, if not in fact, the day of the dictator is over.
George Bush's hardest test as president was giving the green light for Operation Desert Storm. But he is credited with rescuing the tiny, oil-rich nation of Kuwait from Saddam Hussein's million-man army of Iraq. Before George Herbert Walker Bush took his first step into the White House, he learned to walk in Kennebunkport, Maine. Born June 12, 1924, in the town of Milton, Massachusetts, to a family already deeply involved in public service, he was the second of 5 children to Dorothy and Senator Prescott Bush. With high school behind him, George was accepted at Yale University, but put his education on hold. The start of the Second World War beckoned him to serve his country instead. In 1942, George Bush celebrated his 18th birthday by enlisting in the U.S. Naval Reserve. Within a year, he was Ensign Bush, the youngest fighter pilot in the Navy. Taking part in 58 combat missions in the Pacific Theater, Bush was flying his plane on a special bombing mission over China when he was shot down by the Japanese and was forced to bail out at sea. He survived, though his crew did not.
I'm floating around in this raft, paddling, and then all of a sudden saw this conning tower come up and saw the submarine surface.
With the end of the war in sight, Bush set his sights on Barbara Pierce. The two wed in 1945, while Bush was still in the Navy. They would have 6 children, including our 43rd president, George W. Bush, and popular Florida Governor Jeb. Bush left the Navy and graduated from Yale before he and Barbara moved to Texas to find his dreams on an oil field. By the age of 30, he was co-founder and president of Zapata Offshore, which pioneered experimental drilling equipment. But just like his father, Bush was attracted to public service and politics. After losing his first political race for a Senate seat in 1964, he was elected to the House of Representatives 2 years later, serving 2 terms. Encouraged by Richard Nixon to run again for the Senate in 1970, he was defeated a second time. He moved on to high government positions. In 1971, Richard Nixon appointed him ambassador to the United Nations. And in 1973, he became chairman of the Republican National Committee at the height of the Watergate scandal. In that role, Bush urged Nixon to resign for the good of the party.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
President Gerald Ford sent Bush to China as chief of the U.S. Liaison Office. A short time later, Ford called him home to be director of the CIA, and Bush was credited with bringing morale back to the agency. Bush left in 1977 when President Carter entered the White House. By 1979, he was ready to get back into the political ring.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am a candidate for President of the United States.
Bush was seen as a moderate alternative to Ronald Reagan, but dropped out of the presidential campaign after poor primary performances. A short time later, he accepted Reagan's offer to be his running mate. Reagan won in a landslide. During his 8 years as vice president, Bush was credited with softening Reagan's view of the Soviet Union and pressed hard on issues like deregulation and the war on drugs. In a natural progression, Bush became the Republican Party's nominee in 1988, with Senator Dan Quayle from Indiana as his running mate. The Republican team defeated Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis and Texas Senator Lloyd Bentsen.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
During his presidency, the Soviet Union dissolved, the Berlin Wall fell, and Manuel Noriega was arrested, securing the Panama Canal. But everything came to a head when Iraq's Saddam Hussein invaded neighboring Kuwait.
We're not walking away until our mission is done, until the invader is out of Kuwait.
President Bush reacted quickly, committing over 400,000 U.S. troops and building a strong coalition of allies. Operation Desert Storm had begun. The majority of America supported the president's decision to throw Saddam Hussein back into Iraq, and Bush's popularity rating hit an all-time high. Most thought he was unbeatable for a second term. But a broken campaign promise,
Read my lips.
would come back to haunt the 41st president. And in the fall of 1992, with the war a distant memory, George Bush lost re-election to former Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton. Bush traveled to Kuwait to commemorate the Gulf War in 1993. An assassination plot on his life was uncovered, but Bush was unharmed. It was later discovered the poorly orchestrated plan was the work of the Iraqi intelligence service. A Kuwaiti court would convict all but one of the defendants. Bush retired to Texas with Barbara, getting in a few rounds of horseshoes and celebrating countless birthdays by parachuting out of planes, spending time with the family in Maine and reliving memories of when he was a boy.
I can honestly say that the three most rewarding titles bestowed upon me are the three that I've got left: a husband, a father, and a granddad.
While retired, his life was active until the end, joining forces with former political foe Bill Clinton to raise money for the victims of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami and Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The former presidents formed a close friendship, continuing their charity work and enjoying annual lunches at Bush's home in Kennebunkport, and using his experience and insights to serve as a quiet advisor to his eldest son, the 43rd president. Here, attending George W. Bush's Presidential Library dedication in 2013 and sharing a few words.
We're glad to be here. God bless America, and thank you very much. Good job. Too long.
Bush even kept up with public debate by joining Twitter, where he often shared photos of his colorful socks that became part of his signature look. Age brought health challenges, of course, a form of Parkinson's disease that left him in a wheelchair, and brief hospital stays in his 90s for pneumonia, bronchitis, and a fall in his home. But not enough to keep him out of the limelight, throwing out the first pitch before a 2016 baseball game and pregame ceremonies months later at the Super Bowl in his Houston hometown. Reuniting with his former running mate and Vice President Dan Quayle in July, and then catching a glimpse of the rare eclipse that crossed the country alongside his family in Maine in August. One of Bush's last public appearances was at his beloved wife Barbara's funeral, where he met with former presidents, first ladies, and the current First Lady, Melania Trump. Bush recently returned to his vacation hometown of Kennebunkport, Maine, joining fellow veterans for a pancake breakfast before he was hospitalized for low blood pressure and fatigue. This was the first time in decades that neither he nor his wife attended the annual Memorial Day parade. He wrote in a tweet, he is, quote, forever grateful not only to those patriots who made the ultimate sacrifice for our nation, but also the Gold Star families whose heritage is imbued with their honor and heroism. Known for his maturity and straightforward approach, George H.W. Bush called this country to be better in hopes of inspiring the people to be great.
I think historians are going to say that we did pretty well, and that's all right for me. I'm not in any rush. Be in heaven, look down, and let him make that determination.
And tonight, Brett Baer is with us, anchor, senior special reporter and our chief political anchor. And Brett, you think about that. He talks about being in heaven and folks looking down. And tonight we're all thinking about him and his reunion that he's had with his wife and their young daughter that they lost many, many decades ago.
Yeah, Shannon, tonight I'm at the Reagan Presidential Library ahead of the Reagan National Defense Forum this weekend. Behind me, Air Force One, where President Reagan took it around the world, and his Vice President, George H.W. Bush. You know, I think the world will probably, as the President said, smile down. History will tell how the world remembers the term of President George H.W. Bush. But what I'm struck by is the family relationship. I mean, think about this. 17 grandchildren, 8 great-grandchildren. His oldest daughter, Robin, died when she was 4 years old in 1953. When Barbara Bush died, his wife, there was that moment where at the funeral, President Bush was sitting in his wheelchair, Dora Bush, his daughter, behind him, and he is looking at the casket. And it was a moment that really, I think, captured the feeling of this family as he was saying goodbye to his wife of so many years. The other thing that captured the imagination, I think, of the American people was a cartoon, actually, that Barbara Bush is seen going to heaven and reuniting with her daughter, 4-year-old daughter who died, Robin. Now, as you look at these pictures, you think about that reunification, and you think about the love of his life, who he's now with, and obviously with Robin as well. I think history will look back at President George W. Bush as an honorable, decent man and as a good president who changed the trajectory of the United States.
And certainly on the world stage and with the Cold War and his foreign policy accomplishments as well. Brett, if you'll stay right there, we're going to bring in Fox News Sunday host Chris Wallace as well. And I want to read one of the tweets that's gone out from one of his grandchildren, Jeb Bush Jr., saying, "Nothing gave my Gampy more joy than service to others, especially supporting and caring for those who risk making the ultimate sacrifice every day. His leadership taught us to be kinder and gentler, to love each other. We will miss him dearly." And Chris, that's going to be a very interesting conversation for this country to have. And as we've talked about, it will likely be very bipartisan over the next few days as we remember the life of this very special man and former president.
Absolutely. You know, there's a sense in the country now that it's a zero-sum game, that one side wins, the other side loses. And that wasn't the way that George H.W. Bush viewed life, and certainly not the way he viewed politics. As I said earlier, he was very competitive, very tough, fought hard for a variety of positions, fought hard to become president, and was certainly crushed, at least for a short time, when he lost in 1992 to Bill Clinton. But he had a sense of the community that this country is, and there's much more that unites us than divides us. And boy, if we can have more of that conversation over the next few days as we celebrate his life and observe his death, that'll be his last contribution to this country. I wanted to mention, Shannon, that there was a lot of talk today amongst people that President Bush might be in trouble, and we'd heard this a variety of times, that he might be near death. He was a tough bird, and had a number of times he was hospitalized, and things seemed quite serious. So I wrote to a couple of his top staff people, one of them, Jim McGrath, his press spokesman, and I said, I hate to even ask this question, but just is he in trouble? And he wrote a note back and basically said, yes, he's having a tough week, but he's had a lot of tough weeks, and then he bounces back, and he then said, this morning, less than 24 hours ago, he had 3 eggs for breakfast and is at home resting comfortably. So the people closest to him were not at all convinced that this was going to be the end for George H.W. Bush. I also wrote a note to a wonderful woman, really, who's been so close to him, his chief of staff, Gene Becker, in his presidential office in Houston. And one of the things I always got a kick of, and I've been in touch with her over the years since he left office, as we arranged a variety of interviews, the president and all his staff's email address was flfw.com. And I always used to, when I first saw it, I wondered, what does that mean? And I finally figured out, former leader of freeworld.com. And that was kind of the light way in which George H.W. Bush, obviously, he took the presidency seriously, but he didn't take himself seriously. And, the idea flfw.com was his email address.
Yeah, I mean, very lighthearted. And we think about, and we've talked about just how much he loved a good joke, a good punchline. even if it was at his own expense. I mean, he was somebody who accomplished so much on the world stage that it's impossible to go through his entire resume and to remind people about all the things he did domestically and internationally, and what a brave Navy aviator he was, going straight into the war, getting up on his education later, getting through Yale in 2.5 years, which is an accomplishment for anyone, but he just kept charging. And Chris, we talked tonight about how he was a risk taker, and people remember him as somebody, and as we're showing him skydiving, which he loved to do too, that he was somebody who wasn't afraid to strike out in business, in family, in government. He was always, it seemed, rising to a new challenge, Chris.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. I asked him about skydiving and his decision to do that. And even that he put not just as a lark or a personal adventure to him, but as a public service. And he said, you know, I'm trying to send a message to old folks like him at that point. He was in his 80s. He said that you don't have to sit and I remember he put it this way, drool in the corner, that you can get up and you can do something. Maybe it isn't skydiving with the Golden Knights, but you can do something, and you know, you're not, don't put yourself in the grave before you really are there. You talked about his sense of humor. I had the great opportunity one time after I had interviewed him in Houston that he invited me to go, and as my producer, to go off and have lunch with him. And we were talking, remember in 2005, after the terrible tsunami in Asia, he and his son, Bush 43, assigned him and Bill Clinton to go tour the area, and part of it was to raise money by dramatizing the terrible situation there. Now, George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton did not seem like a natural fit. Among other things, Bill Clinton had beaten Bush in the 92 election, in addition to which their personalities couldn't have been more different. And President Bush, 41, regaled us at lunch about their trip together through Southeast Asia. And one of the things he said was, you know, we're so different. Like, he loves to talk and behinds about everything, and I'm maybe more measured. But, you know, a lot of what he said was very interesting, and among other things, if I was having trouble talking about something, I knew that Bill would fill the space. Another thing that frankly drove him crazy about Bill Clinton was the fact that Bill Clinton, and anybody who's ever covered him knew it, was always late, because he would get involved in a conversation, and we always talked about operating on Clinton time. And so they agreed that they were going to get up and go around at, let's say, 9 in the morning in their trips through Southeast Asia, and Bush would be in the car at 9 o'clock or maybe even 8:57, and Clinton would show up when he did. And he said it clearly bothered Clinton that he was always keeping Bush waiting. So one day at about 8:55, he came downstairs excitedly, like he was going to beat Bush into the car, into the limousine, taking them around. But Bush, not knowing this, not doing it on purpose, had gotten in the car at 8:50, and he said the look of disappointment on Bill Clinton's face when he looked in the car and he thought, this guy beat me again, and is in the car before. But one thing that Bush very much respected because they were traveling around on a presidential jet, was the deference that Bill Clinton showed him, and that Clinton, obviously Bush considerably older, always insisted that George H.W. Bush have the presidential cabin and sleep in the presidential bed, and Clinton would find a couch on Air Force One or sleep on the floor, but always paid respect, and, you know, went to great pains to make sure that Bush 41 was comfortable.
And as we watch this treasure trove of memories that we have, all these pictures, and we think about you see there the banners from the Kuwaiti people, and that, of course, was a big moment in his presidency, the coalition that the U.S. was involved with in there, going in to defeat the Iraqis in a flashpoint in that region. And, you know, there was so much that he accomplished on the international stage. We see him there with the troops. Obviously, having served himself, he always had a great fondness as commander-in-chief for our men and women in service. And he continued throughout his life to do things with the wounded warriors well into his retirement in ways that he hoped would inspire other people. And, Brett, it seemed that's what he was always about, was inspiring all of us to give more, to serve more, and to be better.
Yeah, Shannon, listen, you look back at his life and legacy, and you see these pictures of him shaking hands with troops there. Think about that moment. Remember that it was, at that point, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney. It was Brent Scowcroft. It was luminaries in his White House, George H.W. Bush, rallying around him, forming a coalition that really hadn't been formed before on the international stage when it came to Gulf War #1. And he was the template by which other presidents looked at and said, if I can get the world to rally around me like George H.W. Bush did with Gulf War I, this will be a success. If Chris is still on the phone, I'd love to ask him about the transition from President Reagan, as we're standing here in the Reagan Library with Air Force One, where Reagan traveled the world to all kinds of places. The transition from President Reagan to then President George H.W. Bush, their relationship and how, maybe, Chris, you perceive that.
Well, you know, I can't say that they were close friends. And in fact, the very fact that Bush was named as vice president, if you remember back in 1980, Reagan was enamored with what I think everybody ended up thinking was a terrible idea of a kind of almost co-presidency with Gerald Ford, and was involved in negotiations in Detroit at the Republican National Convention, and then it all fell apart, and now suddenly they're in Wednesday night, and they don't have a vice president, and obviously Bush had run the strongest race, had gotten the most delegates, second only to Reagan, and that Reagan at the last minute decided, well, you know, let's go with Bush. So it wasn't his first choice, but I think that they had a close political partnership, if not close personal partnership. And Lord knows, George H.W. Bush in 8 years, there was never a hint of any dissent, of any separate agenda. He was just utterly loyal, at least, you know, to what the public could see, to Ronald Reagan. And Reagan, I think, one, was certainly respected him and thought, you know, I think presidents always feel that the vice president is the one who, because of the amendment that they can only serve 2 terms, can carry on their legacy, and that if you get somebody from the opposite party, in this case it would have been Michael Dukakis, they'll undo a lot of what that president has accomplished in his 8 years. So Reagan was very supportive of George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, and it was a kind of seamless transition from one to the other. It was interesting, though, that Bush, and there was one question, because as you pointed out earlier, Brett, Reagan was much larger than life, in a way that Bush, I think, would have admitted he wasn't, that he needed to establish a separate identity. And one of the things that he did at that New Orleans convention in 1988, when he became the nominee, was to talk about a kinder, gentler presidency and approach to things, and 1,000 points of light, and to sort of establish what his agenda was going to be, not different than, but as something of a departure, something of a turn from Reagan's agenda.
You know, a lot of people, Chris, don't remember. They don't remember the assassination attempt in April of 1993. After President H.W. Bush left the White House, he went to Kuwait to be commemorated for his role in the first Gulf War, and there was an assassination attempt. Kuwaiti authorities arrested eventually 17 people they thought was around this conspiracy to kill then the former president using a car bomb. There was a lot of talk about possibly who was behind this. The United States sent various personnel to Kuwait to investigate on their own. And they eventually came to the intelligence that the United States government concluded that Iraq was behind the attempted car bombing. You know, when we talk about President George H.W. Bush, we often don't talk about the assassination attempt after he leaves the White House, but it was real.
Yeah, and correct my memory, but as we're talking about this, I believe that Bill Clinton, his successor, then had a missile strike on Baghdad on a couple of installations there as punishment for this attempt. And there was always
That's exactly right.
There was always some thought that when his Bush 43, his son, got involved in Iraq, that there was a sense, this obviously wasn't the prime reason, but of unfinished business, like Saddam Hussein went after his father, and that was perhaps in the background a motivation for Bush 43.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
All right,
Shannon,
Chris,
I should point out that they're cleaning up from the National Defense Forum dinner here. So as you hear the glasses clinking behind me, that is the cleanup crew behind me for the Reagan National Defense Forum as they're preparing for tomorrow.
You got a little ambient noise there on a very busy night. Chris, thank you very much for joining us as well. I want to bring in some more folks with very close ties to the president. We've got Dana Perino, Brad Blakeman, former advisor to President George W. Bush, and Juan Williams all joining us now. Juan, I want to start with you because we've talked a lot tonight about the bipartisan appeal of President H.W. Bush, 41, and the fact that he worked across the aisle. And he was somebody who was willing to work compromise to get things done. Your thoughts on him tonight?
Well, you know, I mean, the emotion flows out of me because I was a White House correspondent during the Reagan years, and one of my jobs was to travel around the country with George W. Bush, especially in that '84 cycle when President Reagan was up for re-election. As you've heard, they weren't particularly close, but George H.W. Bush was a great emissary for the Reagan administration because he had been head of the Republican National Committee. So he knew people all across the country in every state. He could tell me names of people in an unbelievable fashion. I mean, it's just incredible. And we would sit together, and I remember one thing that he told me, Shannon, was that I should write notes to people. He would write notes, 5 and 10 notes a day out of habit, just to stay in touch with people, certainly with all the prominent Republicans around the country. But he would write to friends and people, and everybody would respond to him not as the vice president at that time, but as George H.W. Bush, someone that they knew and felt a very personal connection to. When I had the chance to travel with him, to talk with him, I was so, to this day, so impressed with him among all the politicians I've ever met because he was not only a war hero, but remember, he had been our first envoy sent by Richard Nixon to China. And when I went to the Olympics in, I guess it was 2008 in China at the Bird's Nest and all that, I remember talking to him about China. And you remember his son, George W. Bush, spent a lot of time in China because his dad had been there as the envoy. And then, of course, he goes on and heads the CIA, the Republican National Committee, vice president, having previously served as a congressman, and then president of the United States. I don't think we see, if you look at it in historical terms, anybody with that level of public service, commitment, experience, and as I said to you, the greatest measure would be his personal connection to people, especially Republicans across the country, people in the party, hardworking to build party structure throughout. And he really had that kind of personal connection, that kind of political connection that I think is extraordinary in these times. People just loved him. And one of the things that happened for me tonight as I heard about President Bush's death is I just went to the wall, and I don't know if you can see this, but I brought with me a picture of a young version of me and a fairly young version of President Bush. And here we are on what was then Air Force Two, traveling around the country, as I said, going to all kinds of picnics and festivals in order to help Ronald Reagan win re-election in 1984. And then recently, 5 years ago, I sent him a note, and again, I say, you know, he was such a great note writer, and he sent me back a note. This one came from Maine, from Kenny Bunkport, and he wrote about remembering the good old days, traveling on Air Force Two, as he said, and just wrote some kind words to me. this was really very special to me. That's why it hangs on the walls in my home here in Washington. The other thing that strikes me as at this moment so emotional about him is, you know, he was one tremendous baseball player. He's captain of the Yale team. And as you know, his son then went on to own the Rangers and all, but he's a big Houston Astros fan to the end. And we would talk baseball. Now, he's a left-hander, Shannon, and Shannon, you know something about baseball. I know you're a baseball fan. And George W. Bush was an astute. I don't say this lightly. I'm not trying to, you know, celebrate him in some way that's unearned. But George W. Bush could tell you about major league players on a level that I don't think any other politician I've ever met could do. I don't think general managers could talk about baseball and baseball players with the depth of understanding of the game that George H.W. Bush had. So for me, it was like, you know, people would say, hey, you know, I'd come back from a trip with George H.W. Bush, and my wife would say, you know, oh, what's going on? How are you doing? And I would say, well, here's the latest on what we can expect from the Orioles and the Astros and the Yankees from the very top of American political life. This guy was so extraordinary, such a statesman, and such a friend. As you said, able to work across the aisle. We've heard from Brett and from Chris about his work with Bill Clinton. But you should know that even recently, you had Barack Obama going down to Houston and stopping in to visit. And that kind of relationship, again, so extraordinary in these days of, you know, utterly polarized politics.
And a beautiful statement from both the Obamas tonight. But I want to jump in here, and we'll come back to the panel and Brett and all the folks standing by. But because you mentioned his love of sports, we want to bring in sportscaster Jim Gray. We actually have him with us. He's a Fox News contributor. He interviewed the former president more than 20 times. And you know, Jim, maybe even more than the rest of us, about just how much he actually loved sports and had such a depth of knowledge, especially about the game of baseball.
He loved it. He followed it. In fact, one of the great things that he used to talk about, he met Babe Ruth in 1948. And he used to carry around a little card from time to time, and he gave me one of the signed cards that he had with him pictured with Babe Ruth, as you see right there on the screen. Unfortunately, at that time, Mr. Ruth was ravaged with cancer, and but he was able, as the captain of the Yale baseball team, to be able to meet him. And it was a proud moment for him. And you just saw that pitch that he threw out, the first pitch, and it always bothered President Bush that he bounced that ball. He was a great baseball player in college, and so when his son, George W. Bush, threw out the first pitch after the terrorist attacks in September 11th of 2001, he always remembered, President W. Bush would tell me, that his father bounced the ball and how much it bothered him. And so when Derek Jeter came in and told him, "Don't bounce the ball, Mr. President," it refreshed all of those memories. And then President Bush, 43, went out and threw a perfect strike to help lift the nation to try and get on to some sense of normalcy. But President Bush Sr., he also loved golf. He was a terrific fan of the game of golf. And he would show up, and I would interview him regularly at the Ryder Cups and the President's Cups. And his father, his grandfather, George Herbert Walker, created the Walker Cup, which, along with the Ryder Cup, one of the staples and traditions of golf. I also got to see him. I got to play golf with President Bush. I got to see him golf in 1995. A tremendous story when he golfed with President Clinton, President Ford himself. They joined Bob Hope, and he won that day. He shot a 92, but he also hit two fans that day. One off the first tee, it required 10 stitches, and one on the 14th tee, hit the woman in her rear end, and it was funny on the 14th tee, not so funny on the first tee. But President Ford was so excited and so happy because Bob Hope had made a living out of commenting how many times President Ford would hit people, and now President Bush took that up. But he beat President Clinton by a stroke and President Ford by 7 strokes that day. Let me share a little story with you in Valderrama, Spain. We were there for the Ryder Cup in 1997, and it was Seve Ballesteros, a homecoming for him. And so he came over to watch the American team. And it was pouring rain one day, and we were all scattering to get off the course. And I was in my golf cart along with the technician, a sound man, a man named June Kim from NBC Sports. And we were driving and we saw 3 guys standing. One guy had a Glad trash bag over his head and was soaking wet, and there were 2 guys standing behind him. Got a little bit closer, and I said, "That's President Bush." He was standing out in the rain, pouring rain, all by himself, wasn't asking anybody for help. We gave him a ride in on the golf cart, and I'll never forget that he had this trash bag over him and just the humility and the decency that he had. And then the next day, he came back to the golf course, and he, on his own, was seeking out June Kim to hand him a pair of presidential cufflinks. And I just thought, what a remarkable, amazing man to do something like that. Because he got a ride in a golf cart, and he was just wonderful to be around, and he loved to play golf, and he loved to play fast golf. In fact, he was so touched and loved the fact that Arnold Palmer told him that he had been a great contributor to the game of golf, that not everybody's like Jack Nicklaus, who can stand out there and just play for hours upon hours upon hours and concentrate on every stroke. And President Bush loved the fact that Arnold Palmer told him that it was great for the game that he played in 2 hours or 2.5 hours.
Hey, Jim, it's Brett Baer. Listen,
Hi,
you're
Brett.
right. The Bushes play fast. I mean, I only played with them once. Britt Hume used to play with them a lot in Maine, but they could move it on the golf course.
They did, and it was boom, 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 and you know, they enjoyed it, but he wanted to do it fast, and you know, he would concentrate, but in those split seconds, and he could hit some good golf shots, but you know, to him it was a form of relaxation, a form of a challenge, and he used to always tell me how much he could learn about other people by playing golf with them, and if they were really slow, they didn't get an invitation back again. You know, I was also honored, Brett, in 1999 at Brookline at the Country Club, NBC. We were televising the Ryder Cup, and President Bush had come on many times with me to do interviews, and I saw him. They were there to support Ben Crenshaw because Ben was from Austin, Texas, and you know, they were living in Texas, obviously. And I asked, could I interview President Bush, and he said, sure. Well, Barbara Bush walked up to me and he said, "Why are you always interviewing the old man? Come on, get over the old man." And she pointed over to George W. and she said, "That guy's going to be running for president, the governor of Texas. Why don't you put him on?" And I said, "Well, sure. Can we do the whole family?" And so we did the whole family, and it was kind of fun to be told or kidded or prodded by Mrs. Bush. And so we interviewed them both together, and Jeb was also part of it. And President Bush, W. Bush, was able to speak to the team, and they rallied for the greatest comeback in the history of the Ryder Cup. He was the governor at the time, and Ben Crenshaw and the guys came back and won at Brookline. And I asked President H.W. Bush the next day if, in fact, he was the one that was able to rally him, and he was way too humble. He said, "Just gave him a few words of encouragement. I won't get anywhere near trying to take any credit for this."
You know, listen, this is a sports family. Obviously, you're talking about golf here, baseball. President H.W. Bush's prolific baseball career in college. George W. Bush owns a baseball team. There was pride in sports. It meant a lot to them. Did you ever get a sense when you were talking to him about these moments, you know, throwing out the first pitch, flipping the coin at the Super Bowl, how much these things meant to him?
It meant an awful lot to him. I remember talking to him at the Final Four when it was in Houston. And he was a great friend and, you know, such a mentor and a confidant with Jim Nantz, the great sportscaster from CBS. And Jim wrote about him extensively in his book, and they spent countless hours and days together. And I believe he had come in part to some of these Final Fours because he wanted to spend some time with Jim Nantz. But he was always agreeable. And I remember John Thompson, the great basketball coach from Georgetown, had never met President Bush, even though he had coached at Georgetown during the time that President Bush was in office. And it was like a hole that he didn't have because he didn't have that one photograph with President Bush. So I walked him over at halftime, and President Bush was just so... It was, instead of the honor being for John Thompson, it was the honor for President Bush to be able to receive him and spend 5 or 6 minutes before he had to go back on the air. Sports meant an awful lot to him. I remember in 2005 I got to interview both President Clinton and President Bush on the field in Jacksonville before they flipped the coin for the game, the Super Bowl game in Jacksonville. They went out and flipped it together. They had worked on the hurricane relief efforts together and the earthquake efforts that they had gone and had become a team, and so they teamed up and came and flipped the coin. You could just tell that President Bush really, really cared about sports. He called me one time after the Mike Tyson ear biting, and he wanted to know what kind of a guy Mike Tyson was. And I said he's wonderful to be around, and he had made a despicable, horrible mistake, an incident that night, but it just brightened him so much that I thought that Tyson was wonderful. And he said, you know, I don't want to judge him. You know, he's a great boxer, but he was really interested in so many different sports and had a genuine love. It was great to be around. I asked him how many games he would watch in the White House. He said, we got a pretty good satellite system here, Brett and Shannon. He said, I watch quite a bit of it.
And one of the perks of being in the White House.
Your reflections are great.
Thank you.
We want to.
He was a wonderful man. I mean, I was lucky to spend the time with him, and he was a joy. He was a joyous guy who was very, very humble. Decency beyond belief.
Yeah, quite a combination, along with all that leadership and accomplishment. I want to show you briefly a video coming into us a short time ago from a neighbor who stopped by the gates to the Bush neighborhood there. They've placed an American flag and some flowers. Neighbors said they wanted to come by, saying she was saddened by the loss, but spoke very, very highly of the Bush family, and just talked about the fact that she said, you know, there were people who were good people. They knew them as neighbors, had the utmost respect for them, and just wanted to stop by and place something there at the gate. And we can only imagine in the coming days that will ramp up even more. We want to bring Dana Perino back in, and we've gotten a reaction now from former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice tonight. She talked about the deep, broad legacy of President H.W. Bush, and she says he's finished his race with honor and dignity tonight. Dana.
I had a chance to see Condoleezza Rice a couple of weeks ago at an event in California, and she relayed a story about her time working for him in the White House. If you'll recall, Shannon, she was the National Security Advisor, well, not the head advisor, but she was on the NSC, and she was responsible for all things Soviet Union. And when the wall, it was announced that the wall was going to be coming down, they all went to him and said, Mr. President, we have to get ready. You must go to Europe. You must have this moment. And he said, I'm not going. And they said, but sir, you were leading this charge. And he said, what am I going to do there? Dance on the wall? This is their moment. Let them have this moment. I'm not going to go and try to hog the spotlight out there. And it was decisions like that maybe at the moment might sound, oh, well, he's being modest. But I think there was a strategy also to the modesty. And Juan Williams brought up the writing of the notes. The other thing Condoleezza Rice talked about at that event was how George H.W. Bush found it very important and easy to make friends with leaders all around the world. And he got to know them. And he would send them notes. He would call them, ask them about their grandchildren, congratulate them on things that he had read about in the news, and keep in touch. And the reason he did that is because when he needed them to rally around him and around the United States and building a coalition, they would always take the call. They would show up and help America. And I think a lot of that had to do with that personal diplomacy. And he passed that on. It's a really good lesson for all of us to remember that he used to say, don't ever let your first call to somebody be when you ask for something. So that's one of the lessons that I certainly took away from him, Shannon.
Yeah, and the fact that Juan went on and on about those personal notes. I got one from him once, and it is something that you savor, and it makes you feel like, it's such an old-fashioned, beautiful courtesy, and it is such a special thing that takes a moment of your time, but will change someone's life, potentially, and touch them, that you would do something so personal. I want to bring in Anita McBride, who is here now live with me in New York. You worked for more than one Bush administration in many different capacities, but you worked overseeing personnel.
From him when they were born.
He just touched us all, not only as young professionals learning from these incredible leaders of such dignity and service, but also just how he so personally touched each of our lives.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We've got Brett Baer with us, too. I think he's got a question for you as well.
Sure.
Yeah, you know, listen, I think you talk about it, Anita, the service to the country. Think about that this was the last living former president who was a World War II vet, someone who served the country for all of his life, volunteered after Pearl Harbor, decided not to go to college,